Welcome everybody to the July 2018 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. Tonight we have Microsoft MVP Missy Januszko presenting Configuring Active Directory Certificate Services for DSC Credential Encryption. Take it away, Missy.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Missy Januszko, and as announced, I am a Microsoft MVP. I am also my full-time job is as an automation engineer for a financial services company that I'm not certain I'm allowed to say where it's at. So my presentation for today is on Active Directory certificate services and how to configure a certificate services server for a DSC template. Now, this project started probably about 2 years ago. And one moment, I have something still up that should not be up. Sorry about that. This project started about 2 years ago, which is also when I actually started learning DSC. 2 years ago, I didn't know anything about DSC, and I was a PowerShell scripter, but probably, I would say, mediocre at best. I went to a conference called Tech Mentor. And Tech Mentor is actually where, I learned PowerShell from Don Jones in his blazing fast 8-hour tutorial on covering both Month of Launches books. And then the second year I went and I started looking at DSC. There were a lot of DSC related content, and I attended all the DSC related sessions that I could because I thought to myself, this is something I can use at work. This is something that, even though I was an Active Directory administrator, I did infrastructure servers, and even though we didn't build servers all that often, it was a way that I could configure my servers and have them all match, which was really a problem for us as a whole. Maybe not on the infrastructure side so much because we didn't have so many servers. Anyway, when I returned from Tech Mentor, I was determined to learn everything I could possibly learn about DSC, and I spent hours studying the MVA that's available with Jason Helmick and Jeffrey Snover, and I followed along and I would make my own labs. And the one thing that I could not get working was credential encryption. Now, around that time, WMF5 just released, brand new, no documentation. They had just changed all of the requirements to encrypt credentials in Moth files. They had changed the requirements for the certificate templates and didn't really tell you. And I tried configuring those templates manually over and over and over again, and I couldn't get it to work. Long story short, it was user error, and manually configuring that template in a 2008 GUI was a bad choice. Anyway, I thought to myself, there's got to be an easier way to do this. At the same time, at work, we were preparing to bring on a new PKI. It was around the time of SHA-1 certificates being retired. We were talking about replacing all of our SHA-1 certificates, including roots and intermediates. And I thought to myself, man, if I could build a PKI if I could build it with DSC and then have it somehow automatically configure templates for my nodes, then I could try to use DSC on a wider scale. So that's where I kind of started, and I started with just plain old, building Active Directory certificate services. And building a one-tier ADCS is literally like 1 or 2 resources, and it's built and it's there and it's great, but it's not it's a one-tier ADCS. It's not really, it's good for a lab, but it's not really a production-worthy lab. Now, what I'm going to show you, I'm not going to, there are reasons why I would still say it's not really production-worthy, and I'll kind of go over those as I get there. But the other thing that I was thinking was I could use this if I wanted to do an automated build and test cycle. So if I was developing DSC configurations and I wanted to do rapid development of my DSC configs with credentials in the MOFs, I'm going to need a PKI that can handle DSC templates and deploy them to my nodes when they get built. So I took a look at the one-tier config and I thought, it can't be terribly difficult to build a two-tier. One tier is really easy. Well, I was pretty much wrong. What I discovered as I got into it is that, yes, there were DSC resources for installing the ADCS and maybe a little bit of configuration, but for the most part, there were no DSC resources available for doing all of the things that I needed to do inside certificate services. And not only were there no DSC resources, the PowerShell commandlets were pretty scarce as well. So this is what made this particular config much more difficult than I expected. So what I'm going to show today is I'm going to show you how I solved the problem of building a two-tier PKI and having it automatically configure DSC templates. Yes, there's code, but it's more really about how the problems got solved as I hit some of those problems and understanding how to solve them. So let me start with the slides. And I have a couple of slides that I'm going to run through. All right, can you see my screen? Somebody wave and say yes. Nobody's waving.
Still loading. Nope,
Okay.
I got it. It's all good.
All right, cool.
Good now.
Excellent. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is why do I want a PKI for DSC? Why is this such a problem? And the reason why I would want it is because when DSC runs, it runs as local system. So anything that it can do locally to itself with the local system permissions is acceptable and will work. However, if you need to do something like configure something on a domain controller, configure something inside Active Directory, those usually require privileges that are higher than local system. I'm not going to go so far as to say domain admin, but a lot of things do require domain admin. In that case, you would have to specify alternate credentials on the DSC resource where you needed to elevate so that you could set a particular setting. So sometimes those privileges for local system aren't enough, and you need to specify the alternates. Now, if you're specifying alternate credentials, you also need to encrypt those passwords, because if you don't, you're potentially exposing privileged account passwords in clear text, and we all know that's something you don't want to do. So Microsoft provides this mechanism where you can encrypt the credentials in the MOF file. All right, a little bit of PKI terminology. What is a PKI? Public Key Infrastructure It is the infrastructure that deploys your certificates for encryption. Can be document encryption, can be authentication encryption, whatever encryption you need. CA, I'm going to use the term CA, Certification Authority, Certificate Authority. Those are the servers and services that provide your certificates. Your root CA is your base. It is your trust anchor. It has a root certificate, and that is about, it will issue certificates to, if you have a 1-tier PKI, it will issue certificates to everyone. If you have a 2-tier PKI, it only issues certificates to the issuing CAs. And then the job of the issuing CAs is to issue certificates to all your servers, your end entities, your servers, your users. Then we have a couple other terms, and CSP, I'm going to draw a blank on this one because I don't remember what that is, what that stands for. Your CRL is your certificate revocation list. These are certificates that are no longer valid, that you don't want to trust. The CRL distribution point is where your clients will go to get the list of revoked certificates or your CRL. The AIA, or Authority Information Access, is a location that is available to your end entities where it can go and retrieve the public certificates in the chain. So the root CA, if you have a multi-tier PKI that is not, that's more than 2 tiers and you have additional issuings, it can go and get them from there. A standalone CA is one basically that's not Active Directory integrated, and an enterprise CA is Active Directory integrated. So here's a little diagram from Microsoft, and this might be, I want to say, slightly outdated because they give 3 options. They give a single tier where the root and the issuing are on one server, a 2-tier where you have a root and then issuing CAs that communicate with your end, and then you have a 3-tier which includes a root CA which talks to your policy CAs, which talks to your issuing CAs. Now Microsoft, you notice that the documentation that I reference here where the diagrams are is from 2009. So recommendations for PKI design have changed since then. It used to be, you know, if you had a really, really large enterprise, you might want that 3-tier CA. Microsoft has really backed away from recommending the 3-tier CA. They've pretty much went and said it's overkill. The 2-tier CA is the recommended option for a production enterprise PKI. A single-tier CA is good for things like labs and experimenting and things like that. And this whole project started out as an experiment. So, all right, I think I went over a little bit of this already. 1-tier PKI is not recommended for production. It's cost effective, but it's not very secure because your root is online. And you want to do everything you can to protect the private key of that root certificate. Again, 3-tier infrastructure is now overkill. And you want to have strong physical access controls for PKI artifacts. So that private key of your root CA, you want to protect that as much as you can. So that's why a standalone root CA also ends up sometimes, occasionally, I shouldn't even say occasionally, that root CA ends up being an offline CA where you install it, you get your root certificate, you take it down, it never touches the network. There's many more recommendations, and I've included the link to an article on PKI design, there's a lot more information in there. All right, so when building the two-tier PKI, these are the challenges that I faced while I was building this config. There's lots of moving parts. There's actually, besides your root and your enterprise CA that you're building, there's also a lot of Active Directory and domain controller pieces that you need to configure. And everything has an order and a hierarchy and orchestration to what order things need to be installed. Offline root, and I just kind of, this doesn't really give a lot of information, but a lot of the documentation refers to an offline root, but what is really the definition of offline? Well, when they say offline, they really mean offline. You build this thing not on the network, never touches a network, bring it up, get what you need, bring it down, very secure. If you're gonna do this install with DSC, it's got to be on the network. Especially in this configuration, because there's a lot of talking back and forth to the pieces as the install progresses. It also means no PowerShell remoting, so that limits your ability to do DSC. Your only real method of getting a MOF file there is compiling it somewhere else and bringing it on a USB stick and installing it locally. But even that, do you really want a USB stick or something else connecting to your offline root? You want to keep that as pristine as possible. It's almost better to install it manually. All right, enterprise issuing, and I call this the chicken versus the egg scenario. Because the enterprise issuing CA is Active Directory integrated, you need domain or enterprise admin credentials in order to do pieces of this install. You just do. Therefore, you need privileged accounts and alternate credentials. If this is your first PKI build in your infrastructure, you will not have a CA available to encrypt the credentials in this MOF file. So they will need to be in plain text, and you will see that in my config. So there is your chicken and egg. Now, if you have an existing PKI in your infrastructure already, you can issue a certificate in order to encrypt those credentials in the MOF, and then you'll be fine. Lack of PowerShell commandlets. ADCS does not have a lot of PowerShell commandlets. There are a lot of things that still can only either be done with certutil and certrec, or you can do it with, if you're really good with .NET objects, you can do it with the .NET equivalent objects for certificates. I personally am not a good .NET person, so I tend to stick to what is available in PowerShell, or you'll see a couple of examples in here of me using certutil and certrec. The group policy commandlets, and I do set some group policy to set up auto enrollment for my certificates. The group policy commandlets are also not great. Let's see. And then lastly, because your offline root is offline, you need to publish your CDP, your CRL distribution point, and your AIA somewhere that is actually available and online to your clients. So in this case, I believe I'm doing it in an IIS website. You can publish it in LDAP. But you do need to have that somewhere where it is online. All right. So this is the general flow of the configuration. So I start out with the root CA. I build ADCS. I grab that root certificate and I share it. And by sharing it, I mean I'm plopping it in a share for the next piece to come and get. Next, I'm going to publish that root in Active Directory so that it's available to all the clients. Then I'm going to install ADCS on the subordinate. I'm going to import that root certificate because I need it. And then I'm going to configure IIS for the CDP. Then I go back to the root and I issue the issuing certificate once that enterprise subordinate is installed. After that, I return to the enterprise subordinate. I install the issuing certificate. I start ADCS. I configure the certificate revocation list. Then I go back to the domain controller. And here's where the portion of, now the build is done. Now I'm going to set up the auto enrollment, create the DSC template so that I have a certificate template that can be used to encrypt the credentials. I'm going to publish it out into LDAP and then I'm done. Then I have certificates. Because my servers are auto-enrolling, they will automatically get a certificate that is useful for encrypting those credentials. All right, so I have demo here. It's more of just really showing the code because I already have the PKI built using this code. But this is what I'm building. I'm building a two-tier PKI with an offline standalone root CA and an online enterprise subordinate. And I'm following the documentation in that particular URL, which is at the bottom. Which is here. Now you notice, remember I started this project 2 years ago when Server 2012 was the latest and greatest operating system. It does actually still work on 2016. And I'm following along this installation guide, and I just basically wrote script resources or used in-box resources for everything. Now, come on. There we go. So first, I'm just going to show the code a little bit. And I do want to talk a little bit about why I chose to use script resources. And it kind of goes back to me really learning how to do DSC configurations. I wanted to try to figure out quickly if I could do something using the script resources, and then eventually the plan was those script resources were going to be converted over into regular DSC custom resources. Well, I was still learning. I wasn't completely comfortable with creating and packaging the custom resources. I just wanted to see if something would work. Can I make this thing get configured? Can I determine if it's already configured? I didn't really want the overhead of the packaging until I got all of the pieces and parts working together. So that's why I stuck with the script resources. Now, there were times where I started writing custom resources for some of this stuff, and I had a tendency to have what I call squirrel syndrome. So I would start writing a custom DSC resource to do the particular setting that I needed to set. And then I would think, oh, but somebody else might want it to do something else. Somebody else might want it to also do this particular setting or this particular setting, and that should really all be packaged in this custom resource. So I need to handle that, and I found that I was spending too much time writing one custom resource that I was just going to use a little bit of code in and not finishing my configuration. So at that point I said, you know what, I'm going to stick with script resources for now. I'll convert them to custom resources, quote, when I have time, which hasn't happened yet. So you'll see all these script resources in here. All right, so I think the code is close to 1,000 lines. And we talked about the general orchestration. So I set up the configuration, importing all the DSC resources that I needed. And yes, these resources are what I was using at the time when I first started developing it. I haven't moved them to any newer resources. I'm using a configuration data file. So let me bring this up too alongside. And this particular configuration data file is a little bit hierarchical. So I have the all nodes section, which all of these settings will pertain to both the root and the subordinate. And then I have my node specific sections, but then I have this, what I call a role specific section here. So these particular settings are all specific to the root CA. And specific registry settings for the CRL for the root and the subordinate. Anything that was for both of them is in all nodes. Anything that is specific to one particular server is in these sections. And then I load these sections of the configuration data for use in my config by using $configuration data dot whatever my subsection is. So I'm loading it up and I'm setting it all up already in the beginning, and then I am also creating all of my credential objects. So you notice here I'm creating a credential. This is just a regular administrator credential. This one's the domain admin credential. It's also the enterprise admin credential, because I'm using the same one. And then through the configuration, let me find one with those credentials. I think there's one, nope, there. There it is. So I'm using, here I'm specifying an alternate credential, but because my config data has allow unencrypted, so I believe it's up at the top here, PS DSC allow plain text password equals true, it will let me store those credentials unencrypted in the MOF. All right, so a little bit about the code itself. Here I'm just setting up all the Windows features, and then I'm configuring the Active Directory certificate services on the root. And here's basically where I start with all the script resources. So I am going to set my CRL certificate revocation list distribution points.
Do you have all your code on GitHub or somewhere?
I do believe I do. I think I have the link at the end of the presentation.
Thank you.
Sure. And I actually have a separate repo just for this presentation, so I can always publish that too. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and go through 900 and some lines of code, but I just want to show some of these script resources and then some of the more interesting parts of the config. So this is all through here on the root. So then I'm grabbing the root certificate, I'm creating a share, and I'm putting that root certificate in a share so that then I can come in on the enterprise, I can come and get that root certificate from there. That's where this credential comes into play. All right, so some of the interesting parts of the code. I've kind of extracted some of the more interesting parts. So the first one I like to point out is wait for. And I found this really incredibly useful, and it works wonders. So because I am coordinating this install across 3 different nodes, I can have the root install up to a certain point, and then I put a wait for in there so that it will wait until a specific part of the configuration on another node completes before it continues. So this particular one is wait for ADCS sub. So on the root, I'm going to install up to a certain point, which is where the root certificate is available to the enterprise subordinate. And then the enterprise subordinate's going to kick in, and he's going to start his install. And this particular resource is going to make the root sit and wait until enterprise subordinate hits this particular resource and completes it. And then the root configuration will continue. Now, there are various wait for. Get DSC resource. There are a couple of different wait for options that are packaged in the DSC resources that come with the operating system install. So we've got wait for all, wait for any, wait for some. Here I'm using wait for all. And when you have one node, it really doesn't matter. You can use any of these options. But if you have, say you're waiting on something to happen on a web server, and you want more than one to be available before you continue on with something else, then you can use wait for some and say, okay, I need at least this many to be done. Wait for some of these nodes in this list to be done. And you also have wait for any. So if you have 3 web servers and you're waiting for something to be done on at least one of them, then you would use wait for any. So just a couple of different options on orchestrating DSC applies across nodes. So that I thought was kind of fun. And then we have the part of the code that I kind of struggled with. And I call this issue the issuing. And this is basically where you've got your enterprise subordinate to the point where it's installed, but it needs that issuing certificate to be issued by the root so that it can start the service. And in the documentation, it's basically like 3 commands, and it's a couple cert rec commands and a cert util command that accomplish the publishing of the issuing certificate. And what I couldn't figure out was in each of those 3 commands how to actually test whether or not that particular thing was successful. So the first one was assert util, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but one of them was assert util submit or assert rec submit. The second one was assert util resubmit. And the resubmit basically published it, and then there was a retrieve that went and got the certificate and put it in a file. And it was the resubmit that was causing me woe, because I couldn't figure out how to figure out if the first piece of it was done, then it was in a state where I could only do the second piece. And I couldn't test to see if the first piece was done because it wasn't there anymore. It was something very odd. And eventually what I ended up doing was just taking these 3 commands all together and putting them in one script resource. It's either issued, and I can test whether or not it's been issued and it's in a file, or it's not issued, in which case I'm going to go and try to issue it. Now, if there's some state of really, really hosed with that certificate, yeah, the test is probably going to fail. It'll try to set it, it'll fail. But in a normal operating scenario, when you install the enterprise cert, when you install the enterprise CA, it actually does the first step for you automatically. So it does that submit. That certificate is already in that submitted state, so then you do a resubmit and a retrieve. So I ended up putting this all in one resource and testing whether or not the whole thing was done. If I had the file, I was good. If I didn't have the file, it would run through the script and make the file for me. All right. So that is the issuing. A couple other things at the bottom. Once the ADCSs are built. All right. Sorry for all the scrolling. I have a couple of GPO scripts that will create the GPOs for the auto-enroll. And then I'm setting registry settings to get those values into the GPO. And then I add the link to domain computers. And then I create the DSC template. So here is the meat of actually creating the template. And it's a little bit ugly. And all of these settings for the actual template came from some reverse engineering on an existing template that I knew actually worked to encrypt credentials. So I kind of did it a little bit backwards. But this will actually create a DSC template that has your document encryption extended key usage. And then I'm setting a couple of permissions to say domain computers can get a certificate from that template so that the auto-enroll will just automatically deploy them. And I think that is probably about it for the interesting parts of the configuration. The rest is just more This is setting up all the CRL distribution point in IIS and making sure that it's available. All right. So here's the fun part. Once you have the PKI and you have the DSC template, then you can actually use it. So I'm going to do a quick demo of it actually encrypting the credentials in the MOF file. So let's go down to the bottom. And the first thing I'm going to do is create some new directories, both on so I have an authoring box named auth, which is the box I'm currently on. And my target node is S1. Oh, look, I didn't clean up after myself. Okay, so that directory already exists. All right. So next, I'm going to go and grab my certificate that was issued by the DSC template. Now, the one thing that I noticed when I first wrote this code a long time ago, export PFX certificate is what I used to export the certificate into a SIR file. I don't know when, at some point, they changed export PFX certificate to require either password or I think it's called Protect2, and it requires you to list user accounts that are allowed to do the export. In any case, export PFX certificate didn't work anymore, so now there's a new option called export certificate. So I'm going to invoke command and go out and get that certificate. Hopefully that file doesn't exist. Hopefully I cleaned up after myself a little bit better. All right. Now I'm going to go grab that certificate and I'm going to copy it to my authoring box that I'm on. All right. Next, I'm going to just go check out my certificate. It is there. The one thing that I noticed about export certificate is that the certificate looks really funny when you use it, but it does actually do its job. All right. Next, I'm going to show you a very simple DSC configuration that uses credentials. And all this particular DSC resource is going to do, it's going to use the certificate in this file, my config data, and it's going to set the bit service to automatic and running, but it's going to do it under domain admin credentials. So select all, run. Now you get to see my terrible typing skills. All right. I did get a little warning there. The config service is loading one of my, okay. So my MOF is compiled. I'm going to close that config. I'm going to go take a look at the MOF file. And here is my password encrypted as a CMS message. So I can see I do not have, I have my username, but I don't have my password. All right. Next, I need to go get the thumbprint of that certificate that I used to encrypt it. And I need to tell the LCM on the target node to use that thumbprint. So get me that thumbprint. All right. Go into my LCM config for that node. Compile the metamorph. Set the LCM with that certificate thumbprint. And then run the config. Let's check on that service. All right, admittedly, my laptop is not very speedy.
I have a question for you.
Sure. There you go.
While it's really interesting what you're doing,
Mhm.
would it be easier, and this is just a hypothetical question, would it be easier to set up the actual environment first and then just copy over the certificate database to do the actual transfer? Because that's what I assume what you're doing, right?
I'm grabbing the certificate that's issued to the node. Yeah.
Because
Now I
wouldn't you
know.
be able,
Go
wouldn't you
ahead.
be able to, wouldn't you be able to grab the certificate directly from the certificate database? Because the only thing that you're trying to do is when you're setting up a PKI environment, regardless of whether it's an issuing CA or a root CA, depending upon whether you're an offline or online, the only thing you would have to do would be to copy the certificate database and perform a CRL update right afterward to make sure that the database is whole, correct?
I don't know. I've never tried that. That's an
'Cause all-
interesting comment.
Well, the only reason why I say that is because when you're doing a restoration of a PKI environment, you would set up the PKI environment, which you could do with DSC, and then just copy the certificate databases over. Because all it is a JET database. Uses the same database as the DHCP server.
Ah, JET database.
You know, yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, same database.
Honestly, I don't know the answer to your question. I I don't know. It would be an interesting experiment.
Well, all it would be just stopping the service, making sure you do a backup of the database using the cert util command and doing it that way. I'm just curious. I apologize.
Which data? It's okay. No apologies necessary. No, you've given me something to think about. I don't. What would you be getting from the database?
Well, you'd be getting the certificate store, basically. The actual database itself, where you'd be storing the certificates, right?
And where are you putting it?
Well, you'd be putting it in the System 32 directory structure underneath the, there's a path, I can get you the path, where you'd be actually able to copy over the database, because when you move, because I heard that that Microsoft's getting ready to move over to 2016, because they're going to move 2012 into extended support. So I have to start looking at moving the database over to a 2016 environment pretty soon myself, because it's not going to, it'll be supported for the long term, but if you're looking at, keeping your servers up to date, you're going to want to move to 2016 as fast as possible, because it's.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So my initial thoughts of like building a new PKI because we were upgrading.
Right.
And we actually, yes. You could use this or something very similar. Now, in that case, you have an existing PKI, so you could use it to do your credential encryption and use it to build it, and you wouldn't have to go through. The templates we migrated a little bit differently, but that is how we did the
well,
migration.
the templates themselves are stored in. You can find them in ADSI.
In AD, yep.
In the, if I recall correctly, in the configuration container, and then you wouldn't even need to copy them over, because if you have multiple CAs, issuing CAs, they would already be in existence. So all it'd be is all it'd be would be migrating one of the issuing CAs, make sure all the templates are fine, and make sure they've already joined into the new issuing CA, and then after that doing the other one. This way you're not losing the functionality.
Yeah, we had some other reasons for why we were building new as opposed to migrating things. But
well, you did use SHA-2, correct?
Hmm?
You did set it up with SHA-2, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Right, yeah. Are you using a hardware...
an HSM?
Yes.
I want to say I should say I don't know, because I don't work there anymore. Shortly after we started that project, I got involved with the DSC book, and I left and went out and did my own thing for a little while. So I kind of I don't know what the end result of the infrastructure ended up. I do believe that we had an HSM that we were going to use.
Okay, because there's only like 2 or 3 vendors that I would trust.
I don't know which vendor it was.
Was it Thoughtty?
Don't know.
Okay. I apologize.
I really I was not involved in that part of it.
The only reason I was asking is I was seeing what you're doing and it was really quite interesting. But I support my PKI infrastructure at work. One of the things I've started to look at would be to migrate. I've started to look at building a notification system. And and trying to find the easiest way to port out what I needed. And if you take a look at, there's a utility called PKI, which is
Yep. I've seen it.
Yeah, that's the one that I use temporarily because are you familiar with, you can leverage the DLLs, which cert admin DLL, there's two other ones where you just export all of your database directly into a SQL database and perform your notification that way, which I have yet to write.
Now, do you know if PKI has been moved to the gallery? Because I think when I was starting this, it had not been.
It has.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. So
Yeah,
when it comes to the whole PowerShell commandlets not being available, that had a lot of the commandlets that I was looking for. It was just, I think it was on Codeplex, and it was not as, I think Codeplex was going away at the time, and I was afraid the code was going to go away too.
No. What happened is that he moved it over into the PowerShell gallery.
Okay.
And he wrote it using basically those three DLLs with, and then took the DLLs and wrote the commandlets using, it was cert admin certain role.dll, and I can't remember the third one for it. And then you could leverage it using pinvoke, and you can create the commandlets from there if you wanted to.
Oh, I will have to check that out because that seems like it's changed a lot. That would be really useful. Well, it changed a lot since I started writing this. Let's put it that way.
Those three DLLs, you would have to use. You would have to convert the DLLs outward using tmp.imp.exe, if I recall correctly, to extract the necessary libraries so you can then use them within PowerShell if you wanted to. Because then it would be as simple as just add. Then you would be using just the add type and doing it that way.
Yep.
I
will have to take a look at that because that would be really useful for this.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying what you're doing is fascinating to me because I haven't really looked at DSC in a very long time because who has time to look at everything? So,
I hear you.
I mean, the other thing which I noticed is when you were doing the DSC, I was curious whether you were stopping the service and then just copying over the database that way, because like I was saying earlier, all it was the JET database.
Yeah, in this example, I'm not actually doing a PKI to PKI migration. I'm bringing up a brand new one. So I'm not doing any database copies.
Okay. Interesting. Because are you going to be setting it up using the INF files, or are you just taking the default settings?
I believe I'm taking the default.
Okay. Because in order to migrate settings, you would have to use the INF file and create an INF file, which is done by there's a book out there, because PKI Microsoft hasn't really changed the PKI infrastructure since way back in 2003, Server 2003. So the basic DLLs that are out there really haven't changed much at all. the big thing to worry about within a PKI infrastructure is what they call CRL bloat.
Yeah.
Because if your CRL becomes too big and unwieldy, it will cause possible authentication issues when you're trying to authenticate into your network from a wireless hotspot that you have at work. Because the certificate has to authenticate via the chain, and also it has to take a look at that huge list.
And go through that whole list, yeah.
Right. And that's the thing you got to be careful of.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's one of the things that I've had to worry about, because during the rollout that my company had, I had to issue 2,900 certificates twice.
Ouch.
So I wrote code in C# to do that. I got a little assistance from Microsoft on to do that. There's a command in order to remove the certificate out of the library, but with that, you didn't have to worry about the profile, because if it couldn't complete the certificate chain, you never had to worry about that. So those were my challenges within the PKI environment. That's why your presentation fascinated me. So I apologize for interrupting, but
Oh, no problem.
I just was curious as to where you were going with it and how far, because I've set up, we have the web enrollment as well as the NDES environment. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Nope.
And then we have an external CDP set up as well. So I wrote code because they didn't want to do a direct transfer into the DMZ, so I had to write code into our SFTP server to bring up and down the CRL.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I was just very curious. So you're just demonstrating a basic installation of PKI then?
Basic installation of PKI, and then how to issue the templates to use it in DSC configs. Yep. That's about it.
Okay. No. It's a great presentation. I was just curious at how far you were going to take it. That's all.
I do have a couple more things to show, and this is I call it new fun stuff. At the PowerShell Summit this year, Ashley McGlone, one of the he's a former Microsoft PFE. He does some work with ADCS and DSC, and he presented his module called ADCS Template for PS Encryption. It's out there on the gallery. I downloaded it today, so I don't have to do the find module codes out there. But what it does that my configuration doesn't do, when I showed all of those settings that you need to set, that I said I reverse engineered for the certificate template, there's a setting called an OID, which is an object identifier, which is supposed to be unique. Now, in my configuration,
with an OID,
Mm-hmm.
the OIDs are registered with an organization called IANA.
Yeah.
And that identifies what you could put down within the are you familiar with the issuance portion of a template?
Slightly, yeah.
Okay, so what we did is we created a separate OID and registered it, And what that allowed us to do is to give us a different level of assurance. This way, people would know that it's assured by my place of work.
Okay. So the OID that I'm using in this config is actually the Microsoft OID.
Well, that's actually by IANA.
Yep.
It's registered by them, and that's how you would get the first portion. There are certain templates out there that come by default, and they're actually, when you write code against it with the certificate templates, you're actually going against what the OID is in order to pull the actual name out. Because in order to do a certificate on behalf of somebody, what you had to do was you had to get the OID from what they call an auto. It was like I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like a certificate enrollment. So your certificate did the authentication on behalf of somebody. So I can issue a certificate for any one of our templates using this formula and do it that way. Which basically means instead of having the customer having to authenticate into AD in order to issue a certificate, what you can do is you can write code against the template, and then from there it will issue the certificate on behalf of the user, because you always have users that use Macs, and if they don't generate a Windows profile ever, then you have to do it that way in order to get the certificate. Otherwise, it's a manual process.
I see.
Pain in the butt. Especially when you have executives who swear by their Macs. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
It's okay. This particular module will it does some of the things that my DSC code does, only it does it in a PowerShell module, but the one thing that it does that I'm really interested in is it generates a unique OID for your template. So my next, if and when I edit this config again, I will be pulling some of this code in for my template rather than hard coding the OID. But there's also, along with this module, there is an article that Ashley wrote about his template, or about his module. And let me guess, I grabbed the wrong one. Function to create certificate templates. Uh-oh. There we go. So we have his article, and then he also has the YouTube presentation from Summit, where he goes through, I'm not going to show it, but the YouTube video. So I'm going to grab these links, and I'm going to put them in my code so that if you go grab this, you can get the link. So some new items on the PKI front that I thought were pretty cool. And that's all I've got for today.
That was very interesting, and I actually enjoyed. I think it was Larry that was adding some information, because I didn't realize that was a JET database, so that actually helps me too.
I didn't know that either.
Mike, it's called going through the. You ever hear of the term "baptized by fire"? I got baptized between PKI and FIM, or shall I say MIM. In the last 4 years, I had to learn how to write C#, learn how to write SQL queries, pump it to a SQL database in order to do conversions, learn access, learn how to write, learn how to manipulate, write code so that I can use C# to provision users in O365, and provision users into our Active Directory all within a 24-hour turnaround time. Which is insane.
Do you have any of this information blogged or anything? I'd be interested in looking at it.
No, I don't. I'm sure you're familiar with Doug Fink.
Yeah, I sure am.
Yeah, Doug has said to me numerous amounts of time, you have to start blogging, and I just wish I had a load some time, because the issues I've had with Active Directory and PowerShell is that there's no consistency to the Active Directory module. Therefore, and they were really quite slow. So I veered away from PowerShell, using more of the ADSI and the system.directory services assemblies within .NET in order to speed up the process of provisioning accounts out. I had to provision about 2,500 users, and it took too long to do with PowerShell, so I had to do that with C#, and I managed to provision out 2,500 users in 10 minutes.
Yeah, see, the really neat thing is you could take the code that you wrote and just wrap it in PowerShell functions, so so your coworker, whoever, the guy that comes behind you, won't have to learn all that stuff. He can just run the commands, or you can hand it off to somebody else, so you can do some other cool stuff.
Well, the thing that I haven't had a chance to play with, which is the here string, and just wrap the function in there and call it within PowerShell.
It's funny that the identity management system we use is from RSA, which is part of course, Dell EMC, and that creates all the users, all the stuff it does is ADSI, because it's so much faster.
Yeah, there's just no comparison, because and you're 100% right. What Microsoft decided to do was, if you remember the gateway, the PowerShell gateway that it did in 2000. Well, I'm sorry, it was 2008. It basically carried over into 2012, and what Microsoft decided to do was to use that instead of using the ADSI and going that route, which is what caused the inconsistencies within the Active Directory module. I used Jeff Hick's book from PowerShell.org to assist me with writing the monitoring tool that we now use. Instead of me looking at servers, I look at emails in order to find out whether our identity management system is actually working. I have to do it with services, VMware, data stores. I actually got Net Backup to actually work with PowerShell as well. So instead of me doing that in the event viewer, on a day-by-day basis to find out whether there's any problem with servers. So that's how I monitor my systems.
Mike, I'm going to call it a night. Missy, thank you for everything. Larry, thank you for the information. What's up next month?
I just
Thanks
hope
for inviting me.
I just hope I saved you some pain, because I can tell you Mike's books are amazing. So they've saved me some pain over the years.
Yeah, I'm looking to see what's next month. I honestly don't know. Do we have a speaker next month? Yeah, we do. Oh, Tommy Maynard. I'm not sure what he's presenting on. I know he's working on a really cool new module that is in the PowerShell conference book, and he wrote this thing to write the chapter about, and it's something that he kind of has been working on for a few years but never put it all together. So it should be interesting. And Tommy's been doing PowerShell for a while, so that should definitely be a good one. And then we've got Mark Krause in September. But yeah, thank you, Missy. I missed this presentation at the PowerShell Summit. I think you presented it 2 years ago, and the recording didn't work. And
Yeah, we had technical issues with the recordings.
And people came out of your session, and because I had a conflict, and people came out, I said, "Oh, it'll be recorded," and people came out, and they were raving about your presentation. So I was like, "Well, I've got to get her to present sometime for our user group." But I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to go look at your stuff on GitHub.
Cool. Yeah, I just published it, so I think it's out there a couple of times in various variations. I did start writing some of the custom resources, but I haven't gotten very far. Life gets in the way, you know?
What's your GitHub ID? Is it also the DevOps Diva?
No, it's I put the link in the chat window for
Okay.
GitHub.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, she's got a DSC book too, and I own a copy of that book. It's really good.
Thank you. I think there are some things. Yeah, sure. What's up?
The PKI book that I used was from Windows 2008. Just to let you know.
Okay.
I apologize.
That's okay.
That's the book that I use to try to help me through a lot of the stuff. That material is still relevant and will go through 2016.
Do you know what the name of that book is?
Windows 2008, PKI, I forget the rest of it, written by Brian Comer, Komar.
Okay.
Just get it off of Microsoft site. Don't get it off of Amazon.
Okay.
It's cheaper there. Any less money that you have to spend on ebooks, it's a good thing.
Yep. Microsoft Press Store.
So that's how I learned a lot of the stuff from PKI. The other thing that you should look at is the certutil.exe. That has a lot of nice switches. When you do a post install of PKI, to be careful on the length of the validity of the certificate. Most PKI vendors these days set it for 2 years, but with Microsoft's version, you can go to whatever it is internally. There are some companies who use what is known as a wildcard cert, put that into your issuing CAs, from what I've heard, and then just issue the cert that way. I've heard that being done as well.
Yeah, I don't know that I would want to use a wildcard search for that, but
well, if the root CA is, because if you remember, it used to be VeriSign. VeriSign was under the semantic flag, and then got purchased by DigiCert. DigiCert now basically has taken full control over them, and they have a full API set using the REST API, which then you can then write PowerShell modules against that using the invoke web request, if I recall correctly, commandlet, in order to get your the certificate to be issued out of their site, which Semantic never had before.
So the book that Larry referenced is actually also available on Safari Books Online. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we have a subscription through work, so and you can subscribe to that for like $10 a month. So you could subscribe to it or do a free trial and read the whole book.
Wow.
Oh, cool. That would be cool. Yeah, because it's like $48.
Yeah, it's an expensive
Microsoft
book.
Press. Yeah.
If you go on Retail Me Not, you probably can get a code to do it half price.
If you go to Microsoft's Virtual Academy and you sign in there, there's also 2 discount codes, one for the ebook and one for the printed book. You get like 50% off of the ebook.
Looks like Barnes & Noble has the ebook for $27.99. It's $37.67 at Google Play Books.
All right, well, I think I'm going to call it a night, guys. Thank you, Missy, and everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Thanks, everybody.
Great presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Have a good night. Thank you again.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.